On the shores of Georgian Bay, a factory once ran 2 full shifts, 7 days a week, turning out 14,000 pieces every single day. 175 workers. 1 address. 1 unmistakable blue-green glaze that found its way into millions of Canadian homes as wedding gifts, mantle decorations, and childhood fixtures so common, an entire generation assumed every household had one. On December 31st, 2004, the last kiln cooled. The owner ordered every mold smashed, not sold, not donated, destroyed, so no one could copy them. Today, luxury condos rise on streets named for the Slovak refugee who started it all, in the basement of a ski lodge, with clay scraped off a bulldozer's tracks. So how does a ceramic empire that shipped to 6 continents simply disappear? Not through one disaster. Through a border that opened, a dollar that rose, and a world that decided Canadian hands cost too much. Joseph Weider was not a potter. He was not a manufacturer, not an industrialist, not a man with any ambition toward ceramics. He was a showman, a risk-taker, and a mountain man, born in 1908 in Gelnauka, Slovakia, fluent in the language of alpine tourism, accordion music, and opportunity. By his early 20s, he had built a chalet in the Carpathian Range, hosting up to 40 guests at a time as innkeeper, ski guide, and mountain photographer. His son George would later describe him as a smart, energetic entrepreneur with an uncanny eye for what others had not yet seen. In the spring of 1939, Weider traveled to Britain to promote his Carpathian Lodge. While he was there, Germany invaded Czechoslovakia. He sent an urgent telegram home. His wife Helen grabbed their 1-year-old son George and fled. The family reunited in England, applied for refugee status, and that summer immigrated to Canada, arriving first in Peace River, Alberta, a frontier settlement where winters lasted 7 months and opportunity was scarce. They did not stay long. A lunchtime conversation with a Toronto lawyer named Peter Campbell changed everything. Campbell connected Weider with Norman Bodway, owner of Collingwood Grain Terminals and a figure in the local ski club. In the spring of 1941, Weider arrived in Collingwood, Ontario, a shipbuilding, apple farming town on the southern shore of Georgian Bay, with no particular ambition of becoming anything else. The ski club offered 6 acres. Campbell became his financial partner. They incorporated Blue Mountain Resorts Limited, and the 1941 season opened with 2 rope tows, a sleigh contraption called the Red Devil, and a log clubhouse that smelled of fresh-cut pine. 200 to 300 skiers arrived each weekend by train from Toronto's Union Station, drawn north by Weider's relentless promotion. Glue wine from iron kettles, maple syrup tapped from nearby trees, orchestras and barn dances. The local farming community was uneasy about this foreign showman and his strange ambitions. But Weider wasn't performing. He was building. And what he built would outlast nearly everything else the town ever produced. By the early 1950s, the resort was in trouble. No snowmaking technology existed. Unreliable winters could wipe out an entire season's revenue in a matter of weeks. Joseph Weider needed something that would generate income between April and November. Anything to keep the lights on through the months when the mountain sat quiet and the rope tows stood still. The answer came from the mountain itself. During aggressive trail expansion on the Apple Bowl Run, a bulldozer churned through the hillside and turned up thick deposits of blue-gray clay, or Denis Tupi noticed. Born in 1929 in Breznice, Czechoslovakia, Tupi was a trained ceramic mold maker who had arrived in Canada in 1951 and was working as a dishwasher in the resort's ski barn cafeteria. He scraped the heavy lumps off his boots, held them in his hands, and told Wider they reminded him of the clay he had worked with in a pottery factory back home. George Wider recalled the moment plainly. A lot of people would have just let that go by. But Joe was always an opportunist, tremendously creative. In 1953, Blue Mountain Pottery was founded in the basement of the ski barn, a remodeled farmer's building that already served as dance hall, cafeteria, and weekend accommodation. 3 men started it, Wider as the driving force, Tupi as master mold maker, and Mirko Humbalak, another Czechoslovak immigrant, a highly trained ceramic decorator and glazer who had learned his craft in Europe. They built their own kilns with help from neighboring farmers who welded the steel frames. 3 immigrants, working with clay scraped off a bulldozer's tracks in the basement of a ski lodge on a Georgian Bay hillside. The origin story sounds invented. It wasn't. Early products were modest, hand-painted designs on purchased ceramic blanks, ski-themed motifs for the resort gift shop. But Tupi's mold-making precision and Humbolak's glazing mastery quickly pushed the operation beyond souvenirs. Humbolak developed the technique that would define Blue Mountain Pottery for the next half-century. Trademarked as reflow decorating, the method applied 2 different liquid glazes by hand to a bisque-fired piece. During high-temperature firing, the lighter glaze ran through the darker, creating a variegated streaked pattern impossible to replicate exactly. No 2 pieces came out of the kiln looking the same. That individuality became the brand. The signature color, a deep blue-green that caught light like something alive, was said to be inspired by the spruce and pine covering the mountain in summer. The iron-rich local clay left a distinctive red base on every underside, a geological fingerprint connecting each piece back to the hillside where it began. The pottery existed to save the ski hill. For a time, it saved everything. By the early 1960s, Blue Mountain Pottery had outgrown every building it had ever occupied. Growth arrived fast and kept arriving, the kind that changes a company's nature entirely and leaves no room for sentiment about how things used to be done. In 1963, production moved to a former aircraft factory on Pine Street in downtown Collingwood. The move announced something. This was no longer a cottage operation running on immigrant ingenuity and borrowed kiln space. This was a manufacturer, and it wasn't finished growing. Shortly after, the company relocated again into a purpose-built showroom, retail center, and factory positioned directly at the Blue Mountain Gateway, planted in the path of every tourist heading toward the ski resort. The feedback loop that followed was almost too clean to believe. Visitors came for the skiing and discovered the pottery. Visitors came for the pottery and discovered the mountain. Each operation fed the other without effort. Key hires transformed the factory floor. Alfred Dubby, formerly of Stetson China in the United States, arrived as plant manager by 1965, bringing American manufacturing discipline to a company that had been running on instinct and craft. Then came Dominic Stanziani in 1966, an Italian immigrant, born 1935, hired to oversee a new studio within the factory complex. Stanziani was a master potter who created hand-thrown vases and bowls in bright yellow with orange drip glaze, signing each piece Dan or DS. Groups of tourists watched him pull a finished form from raw clay in a single sitting. The factory floor became live theater. His pieces now fetch over $200 in the UK collector market. The production process was industrial in scale, but retained every handcrafted element that gave each piece its character. Red clay, sourced first from the mountain slopes and later from Shelburne and Brampton as local supply ran out, was screened for impurities, poured as liquid slip into plaster molds, hand-smoothed at the seams in a process called fettling, bisque-fired, glazed using a two-step brush and dip method, then fired again at high temperature to produce the trademark streaking. The glaze formulas were proprietary and closely guarded. Competitors tried to copy them. None succeeded. By the mid-1970s, the workforce had reached between 125 and 175 workers running 2 full shifts. By 1974, the line was turning out 14,000 items every single day. Animals, vases, jugs, bowls, tea sets, lamps, wall plaques, bookends, and the Apollo range, introduced after the 1969 lunar landing. A pottery factory in a small Ontario town, marking humanity's arrival on the moon in drip-glazed ceramic. The empire was at full tide. Nobody inside it could yet see the waterline beginning to drop. There was a period, roughly 2 decades, running from the early 1960s through the late 1970s, when Blue Mountain Pottery achieved a cultural saturation so complete, it became almost invisible. Not rare, not collectible. Simply there. The way a telephone was there. The way a set of encyclopedias was there. Present in the background of Canadian domestic life without requiring explanation or notice. The blue-green animals stood on mantels, bookshelves, and television sets from Halifax to Victoria. Bears, eagles, swans, deer, dolphins, a menagerie of Canadian wildlife rendered in that unmistakable drip glaze, standing guard over living rooms where children grew up assuming every home had one. Collector Mary Duncan documented what many already knew. Many a bride and groom in the 1960s and 1970s received Blue Mountain Pottery as a wedding gift. 2 of her older sisters had been among them. The experience was not unusual. It was nearly universal. The export numbers tell a story that defies the company's modest origins. At peak, 60% of all sales went to foreign markets, with 2/3 of those exports destined for the United States. Products shipped to Britain, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. A Canadian researcher once found a Blue Mountain Pottery jug in a hostel in Nelson, New Zealand. A remarkable footprint for a company that had started with 3 men and a lump of clay in a ski lodge basement. Recognition followed reach. The 1967 Canadian Centennial was marked with a commemorative Blue Mountain mug. Canada Post released a stamp featuring the pottery. Collections entered the Royal Ontario Museum and the George R. Gardner Museum of Ceramic Art in Toronto. What had begun as a desperate survival strategy for a struggling ski resort had become a legitimate piece of the country's cultural record. The factory itself drew visitors as surely as the mountain did. Robert Blair led personal tours through the production floor. Tourists watched Stanziani demonstrate at the wheel, then walked into the showroom and bought what they had just seen created. Local clay, local hands, sold to visitors who carried a piece of the landscape home. A 100-mile industry before the concept had a name. The rhythm of the factory had been absorbed into the town's own pulse, the way you absorb the sound of a river running nearby and eventually stop noticing it is there. But underneath the peak, the ground was already shifting. Consumer taste was beginning its slow migration, and the global trading order that had made all of this possible was quietly being rewritten. The forces that killed Blue Mountain Pottery did not arrive all at once. They came as a sequence of cuts, each one survivable in isolation, fatal only in combination. By the time the last arrived, there was nothing left to absorb it. The first cut was aesthetic. Blue Mountain Pottery's signature look, heavy, dark, organic earth tone, was quintessentially 1960s and 1970s, at home alongside shag carpet and wood paneling. By the 1980s, consumer taste was migrating toward minimalism, toward Scandinavian-influenced design, toward lighter palettes and cleaner lines. The glazed animals that had anchored a generation of Canadian living rooms began to look like relics from someone's parents' house. The company responded. New glazes appeared: mountain blue, autumn red, a deep cobalt with white flashes called granite. A Georgian Bay cookware collection launched in 1984. A Canadian wildlife series in 1985 used white clay instead of the original red. A Millennium collection with imported English clay and high-gloss white glaze abandoned the original aesthetic almost entirely. Diversification is a word for running in several directions at once. None of these directions ran fast enough. The second cut was structural. Before the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement took effect on January 1, 1989, Canadian tariffs on consumer ceramics ran at approximately 15 to 20%, enough to offset the cost disadvantage of a small-volume Canadian manufacturer competing against overseas producers. The FTA phased those tariffs to zero over 10 years. NAFTA continued the process in 1994. The Uruguay Round and the formation of the World Trade Organization in 1995 reduced most favored nation tariffs on ceramics from all countries by roughly 40%, bringing them down to approximately 7%. 7% was not enough. It was not close to enough. Then came the blow from which there was no recovery. On December 11, 2001, China acceded to the World Trade Organization. Chinese exports surged at 30% per annum. Canada imposed no anti-dumping duties on Chinese decorative ceramics, unlike the United States and the European Union, which at least attempted to slow the flood. Canada left the door open. Blue Mountain was not dying alone. The entire Canadian pottery industry was collapsing around it. Medalta Potteries in Medicine Hat had gone bankrupt in 1954. Céramique Dorée in Quebec closed in 1989. Sovereign Potters in Hamilton, which had employed 450 workers at peak, was driven out by imports. By 2025, only 200 ceramics manufacturing businesses remained across the entire country. The Canadian Crafts Council dissolved in 1996. No safety net existed. No government program intervened. The pottery faced the storm without shelter, and the storm did not slow down. Robert Wilson Blair was born in 1927. He joined International Silver as Senior Vice President and General Manager in 1971, rose to President and CEO, and eventually acquired a minority ownership stake. When International Silver entered receivership in the mid-1980s, Blair came out of retirement to rescue the company he had spent 15 years building. In November 1986, he reformed it as Blue Mountain Pottery 87, purchasing the company name, logo, and original molds at auction. From that point forward, Blair was the sole owner, president, and decision-maker. The pottery's fate and his own were the same thing. He led factory tours personally, spoke at collector events, and maintained production quality as the market contracted steadily around him. In 1982, he had hired David Bennett as master mold maker and designer. Bennett created the Premium Roar collection, named for Robert and Marion Blair, and the Robert Wilson collection of limited edition figurines. These were genuine attempts to move upmarket, to cultivate a collector niche as the mass market evaporated. The pieces were beautiful. They were well made. They weren't enough. The fatal convergence arrived in 2003 and 2004. The factory operated on a lease expiring in February 2005. Blair owned separate property near the Pilkington glass factory area, and a costing analysis on building a new facility there reached a stark conclusion. The move would be revenue neutral, not a path forward, just a more expensive way to stand still. Blair was in his late 70s. He had survived cancer. His children had no interest in taking over the business. No prospective buyer materialized. Who would buy a Canadian pottery factory with no tariff protection, a strengthening dollar, collapsing tourism, and a distribution channel disappearing store by store? The arithmetic was merciless, and Blair could read it. He informed the Blue Mountain Pottery Collectors Club before telling the media, an act that says something about where his loyalties lay. Newspapers filled with retrospectives as the year-end closing approached. The coverage had the quality of an obituary written while the patient was still breathing. Then Blair made a second decision, arguably the more consequential one. He ordered the molds destroyed. He feared that if sold, they would end up in China or a developing country, used to produce inferior replicas under the Blue Mountain name, degrading the reputation he had spent his working life building. The molds were smashed deliberately, methodically, finally. No future revival using original tooling would ever be possible. It was an act of destruction that was also an act of love. The last owner broke the thing he had protected for 30 years because he could not bear to see it made badly by someone else, somewhere else, for less. On December 31st, 2004, the last kiln cooled. The business was formally closed on February 5th, 2005. The remaining employees were laid off. Collingwood was already scarred. The shipyards had closed in September 1986 after 103 years of continuous operation, eliminating up to 1,200 jobs in a single stroke. Between 2004 and 2008, the town also lost Nan Products, Backyard Products, Kaufman, Goodyear Tires, and Alcoa Wheel Products. A cascade of closures stripped the town's industrial identity entirely. But Collingwood had what most factory towns did not. It had the mountain. By 2006, Blue Mountain Resort was drawing 700,000 skier visits a year. By 2021, the town's population had surged from 13,000 to over 24,800. Today, luxury condos rise on streets named for the wider family. 2 million visitors a year come to ski the mountain and walk the village, spending money in shops that sell nothing, made within 500 kilometers. No trace of the factory remains. But in living rooms and basement shelves and collector cabinets across the country, the blue-green animals still catch the light. Each one is slightly different from the next. Each one carrying the fingerprint of a glaze that ran differently every single time it was fired. Made from mountain clay, made by Canadian hands, in a factory that no longer exists, in a country that used to make things.